Hello everyone, and welcome to a special Work Foundation event with the Right Honourable Jonathan Ashworth MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. It's part of our new series of interviews at the Work Foundation with leading politicians to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing the UK labour market. My name is Ben Harrison and I'm the director here at the Work Foundation, a policy think tank based at Lancaster University. For those of you who don't know us, the Work Foundation has a long and storied history stretching all the way back to 1918 and the formation of the Industrial Society. And throughout our various guises over the course of the last 100+ years, we've consistently been committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment and to tackle structural inequalities in the labour market. Now, we know how quickly the political, economic and financial sands have shifted in recent months. We're now, it seems, in recession. We have a government overseeing substantial tax rises and spending cuts, and we have forecasts of rising unemployment, persistent inflation and falling wages into 2023. And yet, at the same time, economic inactivity continues to grow and vacancies remain high in particular sectors as employers are struggling to recruit. And these are the sorts of issues that I want to get into with Jonathan today. If throughout the course of the event you have a question for Jonathan, then please use the Q&A tab if you're watching on Zoom and the comment function if you're watching live on YouTube. And if you are a journalist, if you could also make clear which publication you're writing from, that would be great as well. Now, this is primarily an in-conversation event, but I will do my best to try and bring in some of your questions as we go. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I do know that there is a potential that you may be called away at the last minute for a vote during the course of the event. To everybody who's watching the stream, if that does happen, then I'll be joined by the Work Foundation's Head of Research. We'll reflect a bit on what we've heard so far, and then once Jonathan has voted, he will hightail it back to the event, and we will be able to get back on with finding out more about the Labour Party's policies and positioning. With that in mind, Jonathan, to get us going, I wondered if you would mind just briefly setting out the big challenges as you see them for the UK labour market and outline some of the ways in which you envisage a Labour government, if it were to be successful at the next general election, really tackling them.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and it's an absolute pleasure to join you on the Zoom call. To congratulate the Work Foundation for everything you have done in this field. I didn't quite appreciate your history went back so far. But I know that the work that you do, the research that you are involved in, and the recommendation that you produce are incredibly well received and important. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to associate myself with you this afternoon. Apologies to the viewers in advance if there is a loud bell ringing, which sounds like an old-style school bell. That means I have to whiz off and vote, but I will come back as quickly as possible. Should only be around 10 minutes max. I want to start by first of all saying there are huge challenges in the labour market at the moment, and Ben has run through them. We're in recession. We are facing 500,000 people are facing losing their jobs. We've seen this tight squeeze on wages, that have been with us for some time now. A desperate collapse in living standards projected by the OBR, and at the same time, huge vacancies in the economy at the moment, 1 million or so, with projections because of demographic change in society that will be short of around 2.3 million workers by, I think, the end of the decade as well. That was some analysis the Institute of Longevity produced. So we can see there are huge challenges. So what is the Labour response? Well, first of all, I think it's worth just saying this because we sometimes forget it. I think it's important to be clear that a Labour government will be explicitly committed to the goal of full employment. You know, not all governments throughout our history have been committed to the goal of full employment, and of course, famously, the famous Treasury reaction to Keynes when he proposed full employment back in the day. I mean, I remember exactly what the Treasury said about it when Keynes sent his proposals in, but they were not entirely complementary to what Keynes was proposing. But to have an explicit goal of employment is an important standard for a government, and that is one that we would adopt. We've talked about having or aiming towards the ambition of the highest employment in the G7. That is a proposal that the Learning and Work Institute have been advocating for. We think that is a good, important goal as you move towards the bigger goal of full employment, which we accept, which we sort of define or broadly define as, even in the field, have broadly defined at around 80%. If you can increase the numbers in work, that obviously boosts your economy, it improves your public finances as well. But work is important for people. And because we've lived perhaps in a society where unemployment hasn't been the political problem perhaps it was in the 1980s, I think sometimes forget how important work is, and the ability to provide for yourself, for your family, to build a home, how vital that is to your individual sense of worth and well-being. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and I was born in Salford, grew up in Manchester. I remember those periods of unemployment that my father experienced. And I remember queuing up, only as a child, 6, 7 sort of age, but I still remember queuing up in the dole office with my father in parts of Greater Manchester. And I still to this day remember the haunted look on the faces of men who'd lost their jobs in industrial sector. My dad worked in the service sector. My dad was a crew casino, so it was a different type of work, albeit he started off on Salford docks. But I remember the haunted faces of men who had lost their jobs in the industrial sector. And it's why, for me, unemployment is never a price worth paying. If you remember the response of the government in the early 90s, was that unemployment was the price of paying to get inflation under control. So where are we today? We've got inflation at levels that we've not seen before, and the government is pursuing a strategy of taking demand out of the economy, having hugely stimulated demand. I'll try to 8 weeks ago is now taking demand out of the economy, and the OBR is projecting an increase in unemployment. But at the same time, though, as well as that, we've also got this phenomenon of, if you like, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, and it's important we are careful when we talk about this group of people, but this huge increase in those who are economically inactive. Some of that is the over 50s who apparently some of them have decided, well, post-pandemic, they want to do something else with their lives, perhaps take early retirement, perhaps spend more time with their family. They draw down a bit of pension pot, perhaps, and might have to see in their homes. But we've also seen this increasing numbers of who are out of work for reasons of ill health or disability. With the OBR, I think now projecting that we'll be spending over £1 billion extra a year on the benefit. Well, it's obviously important, and I want to underline this point to anybody listening who may have concerns or worries. It's obviously important that if people cannot work, either with sickness or disability, or perhaps they're caring for their children, I think the solution is another punitive approach of ever more sanctions, ever more humiliating capability assessments. You're always going to have a degree of assessment in your system, obviously, but at the same time, I think we've got to rethink the way in which we provide people with support and help and coping and access to training. And this is the thing I've been talking about today in the Financial Times. I think it's staggering that, according to the Local Government Association, a survey they did last year, £20 billion is spent to deliver 49 different employment and skills schemes, organised 9 different departments, and yet we do not seem to be getting bang for our buck, these various different schemes in the system. And I think a much better approach would be to devolve more. And I'm talking about schemes like when you see things like work, Restart come along, or work and health programs come along, things like that. I think they are more effective when delivered and devolved at a low level, like the Working Well project in Greater Manchester. And what I've announced today in the Financial Times is that a Labour government, that cohort of schemes that the Department of Work and Pensions is responsible for, we would devolve those budgets to local areas, would power and resource out of Whitehall and to mayoral combined authorities or local authorities to deliver a more bespoke scheme on the ground, which can better link with local employers, the local health service, better link with local skills providers, like they're doing in Greater Manchester. So that is something we're talking about today in and the we've got other ideas as well, but perhaps we can get into that in some Q&A, because I don't want this to be a monologue. But that is my that's my sort of starter for 10, if you like, Ben.
Fantastic, thank you, Jonathan. And I've got to say, it is very welcome, I think, to see Labour proactively putting some flesh on the bones of its policies in this space, given how urgent they are really in the post-pandemic era that we're now in. I think it allows for a far richer debate really around what the right way forward is over the coming months and years, and of course leading into the next general election. There is an awful lot in, I think, what you're saying. So if it's all right with you, what I thought we'd try and do is sort of unpack some of it and sort of almost break it into chunks to then sort of interrogate it a little bit further as to some of the kinds of policies that you're reflecting on there. Work and health is clearly a really important element here, and I think in the FT article today you referred to Britain as the sick man of Europe, and the stats certainly to a degree reflect that. We have 2.5 million people now out of work and not looking for work due to ill health. That's risen post-pandemic, and over a quarter of all of those who are economically inactive are so because of long-term sickness, and that's the highest proportion, I believe, since records began in 1993. Clearly, part of that is a sort of reflection of a poor record of being able to get those with long-term conditions into work. But perhaps there's also other factors here around mental health, burnout, some of the data beginning to suggest long COVID. So it would be great, Jonathan, to get your reflections on what you see as sort of some of the underlying causes of that sort of ill health that we're seeing across the nation.
I think, yeah, and I think, as you know, or the viewers may know, I spent what felt like forever as Labour's health spokesperson, and I think what that gives me an insight into how we can better link up our National Health Service health support with our employment support services and our job centre services. And I think I should also say, and I do think this is a point, it's a slightly obvious point, but it's one that gets forgotten. For me, the Job Centre Plus, and the wider suite of employment service schemes that offered, that is a public service. That is public services, and I look at that bit of it as a public service reform agenda, if you like. And the reason I make that point, even though I shouldn't have to make that point, is that I think too often the job centres become a terrifying service. So people fear a letter from the DWP or the job centre. So people don't necessarily want to go to the job centre, get support, and insurance should value community. The colleague of my team, DWP team, was a good talk about the job centre should play learning work in every community. And should be an open door betting to employers, providers, people to go down. So we'll complete culture change, we new approach to that. But to that point about sickness and health, we know a growing burden of or issue amongst those who are health is growing burden in society and mental health problems. Right? In the old days, governments, the end Labour government, and I worked in Labour government, so I'm proud of lots of achievement of the Labour government. The old days, I know so can Smith is, it's all about testing people, making people prove what they could do. Look, we didn't cohort people of worse sickness as remain on this, and in fact, MR, one of the think tanks have made out that we look at those who are out of work, sickness on employment support allowance, only 4% a year flow off that group and into work. So these old systems of threatening people and hassling people, they don't work. They don't give people the support they need, especially if you're out of work for a mental health condition. What I think we are beginning to see now in the NHS is where the NHS England has decided to fund individual placement and support, decided to fund more employment help via clinical advisors, by the clinical team in mental health services, and actually work with people and support people. That does seem to have some evidence of that working and how getting people back to work. So that's something I think we are very interested in and want to explore. And I want to see more of this joint working between the NHS and our job centres and an employment support services. There's another sort of bit of this, which is action. I've done a lot of work on addiction, family history, and I've even ran 300 marathons to raise money for an addiction charity. So that shows you how committed I am to this. That's not my proposal of how I'm going to fund all this, by the way, but I think giving more specialist help people with an addiction problem has to be part of this as well. And actually, why shouldn't we also be thinking about employment support in primary care? I mean, of course, you've got a bigger argument as well about how we need to fix your NHS and fix access to health services. Increasing number of people out of work for reasons of sickness are probably stuck on a waiting list, or if they're not stuck on a waiting list for treatment or surgery, are probably having problems getting ongoing management of their chronic condition as well, which is making them sicker out of work. So we need to look at that. A third point as well, which I'm exploring and want to work more closely with various of my colleagues in the Labour front bench, is that helping people into work is an ongoing dynamic process. It's not the old days where you get them into work and then you forget about them. So what is the role of a modern occupational health service? Yeah. In theory, the DWP is supposed to have something called Fit for Work, it's supposed to be to help with occupational health. Well, what does that do anymore? So there's so much more we need to be doing. Let me just give you one more example before you move on to the next question. Access to work to help people with disabled people or people out of work who've got a mental health condition. The constituent came to me with wants access to work in order to return to work. There's a 26-week waiting list for an assessment. When I raised that with the DWP, my capacity as a constituency MP, the letter came back from the DWP saying, "Yeah, sorry, it's 26 weeks at the moment." Yeah, I mean, how are we supposed to help people move into work if they've got to wait 26 weeks for an access to work assessment? So there's so much that needs to be fixed across the board to really help people move into work. And these are people who want to work as well. So we've got to be doing so much more.
Absolutely, Jonathan. And I think what you've sort of described there across the 3 points you made is the extent to which, yes, elements of this are going to be led out of the Department for Work and Pensions, but clearly this has to be across governmental effort, because it touches upon so many other areas of whether that's health or whether that's education and skills, as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, or links into what the Department for Business might be doing. But I did just want to kind of move us into, because I know this is a sort of a very large part of what you've sort of set out today, and that is this prospect of devolving responsibility and delivery for trying to find some of the solutions to the challenges that we've talked about so far. And I suppose one area that I wanted to kind of start with before we maybe get into some of the implementation questions is the sort of the top principle, really, which is obviously devolution by its nature is likely to lead to some different approaches being developed in different parts of the country. That's the kind of tailored element of this. But that might also lead to some different outcomes. And I guess it would just be interesting to kind of hear your reflections on how Labour sort of gets comfortable with that in a way that it could risk either extending some existing inequalities or perhaps creating some new ones, and how you might deal with that in government.
Oh, this is a brilliant question, and I think it goes to the heart of, to be frank, every area of public sector reform, really, doesn't it? And in fact, it was the great debate that was at the heart of the funding of the National Health Service. Bevan wanted a very centralised national health structure, and had big arguments in the Labour cabinet. Herbert Morrison, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, who'd come from a local government background, who wanted local authorities to have a greater say and greater control in the delivery of the National Health Service. Bevan won. Bevan won out, and we've had a very centralised National Health Service ever since then. There's still people to this day who will argue that, leaving aside accepting the principle of free healthcare, that we should have gone down the local government model rather than that very centralised system. And this is that always impacts on public services when you're talking. I think, though, the idea that you can run all this from Whitehall is frankly for the birds, because you've got different economies and different labour market issues in different parts of the country. So in broad brush terms, very broad brush, we know that our sort of post-industrial area, coastal towns, what journalists now obsessively call the Red Wall, tend to have high levels of economic inactivity, but low levels of vacancies. City areas like the one I represent, or Birmingham and so on, with lots of inner city deprivation and perhaps particular issues with different ethnic minority communities, where perhaps English language may be an issue. We have high levels of inactivity, but high levels of vacancies. So, and actually, big swathes of the south of England have low levels of economic inactivities and high vacancies. So that is obviously very broad brush. But the point is, different parts of the country have different labour market needs. So I think local areas are better placed to design an employment support system to suit that. When you look at the evidence from Greater Manchester, they've got the Working Well project. So their bit of work and health money was devolved to them. Been to visit it, I've spent time on the ground shadowing some of the work that they do and having meetings with the really impressive people who run it, and Andy Burnham himself. They were telling me that for every £1 of investment, they get £1.75 back because they're getting people into work through the sorts of project that they are doing on the ground. So that suggests to me that is a better approach than what happens at the moment, where the DWP do a national contract, who are effectively won by the big outsourcing giants, all the names that we're familiar with. And I'm not knocking them. I'm not. That's not what this is about. And they subcontract with different firms across the country. I just think trying to run this very tightly from the DWE doesn't work. I think local areas are better placed to deliver this, working in partnership with the job centres. I mean, the job centres will still be part of a DWP network, but I also think job centres need greater flexibility on the ground as well.
So I suppose, Jonathan, that sort of takes us into some of the territory around funding as well, because clearly we know that over the course of the last 12 years, really, we've seen some pretty significant cuts to local authority funding and their ability to really sort of develop capacity in some of the kinds of areas that you're describing. As part of these plans to devolve some more of this to a local level, how would you sort of factor in rebuilding some of that capacity and making sure that there is funding at the local level to be able to do this well?
Well, first of all, I think we need proper assessment of what is currently being funded and how it's being funded. We have this quite bewildering sort of collection of different schemes funded from different pots of money. And as I say, the LGA did a survey last year, and they argue that £20 million is spent across 49 different schemes delivered by 9 different departments, and that's all the different DWP schemes. It's the various Department for Education and Skills bits. You've got the successor to the European Social Funding, which I think is called Shared Prosperity Fund, and then there's other departments in that as well, little bits and pieces as well. And we're spending £20 billion. So the government is spending £20 billion. Yet I don't think anyone would argue that we've got an employment and skills support service which is anywhere near delivering what we would expect, even though we're spending £20 billion. So first of all, I think we've got to get better at reforming the system that we have and understanding what it's being spent on. I think there's duplication in that. I think there's inefficiencies in that. I think people are being bounced around from different schemes here and there and not really getting the sort of help and support that they need, because a lot of these schemes are basically given to companies who have to deliver sort of targets on contracts, and rather than actually genuinely helping people and giving them the specialist tailor that they want. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we're not making a sort of commitment today on how much money we would put into this scheme, but the Restart, Kickstart, and one or two other schemes have currently underspent by £2 billion. Now, a £2 billion should be enough in rough terms to help 1 million extra people with support. So again, why are these schemes under delivering? And that is something the government could do something on now. I mean, I don't want to be too political for sort of sake of it. I think being party political for the sake of it is kind of boorish. It's not my approach. But the government have announced a Mel Drive is going to have a review Jeremy Hunt announced this in his autumn statement 2 weeks ago. We could be reallocating that money now to deal with some of these problems that we are highlighting. So I don't understand why the government won't do that.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned that, Jonathan, I suppose around, the kinds of target outcomes that the government is hoping to have from the schemes, and they're not being met, underspends, etc. I suppose one of the features, thinking of devolution and the kind of city deals that we've seen so far, well, probably over the course of the last 7 years, really, have been quite a lot of sort of centrally set targets. So yes, there's been elements of devolution, but actually in order to kind of access funding, there's been quite tightly controlled outcomes. Local authorities find themselves essentially having to respond to what the centre is asking for almost endlessly. And I know there's lots of frustration across the sector in that. More broadly, given sort of devolution is such an important element of this, do you have a feeling for, if not the sort of all the detail of it, but just how Labour would approach doing that, to give local areas the kind of freedom that they might look to do some of the innovating and the tailoring that you want to see?
Look, I wouldn't want to be heavy-handed, and I'd want to, talk to local areas about their plans. I think inevitably any national politician is want to go into set some expectations and standards about what they want to be achieved in broad terms. But I think it's really, really important that local areas are given the space, the political backing, and the resources to pursue different innovative solutions, as you say. But it's a bit like, increasingly now, in the National Health Service, for example, you have national standards that you expect local health authorities, for want of a better phrase, to try and meet. You have access standards on waiting times and an A&E. I mean, let's just leave aside the fact that none of them ever meet them anymore. Probably haven't met for 7 or 8 years. But in theory, they have national standards that you want to meet. I think people would still want to be reassured that there is a plan to try and support to give help to the inactive who want help. That there is a plan to try and get to support, depending on the economic circumstances, young people who are not in education, employment, training. There'd obviously be some framework at national level, but I would be very clear that we want local areas to get on and deliver the solutions which are appropriate for their local area.
Yeah.
So it's not as black and white as there is always room for working together. And there is that bell. So let me whiz.
Fantastic. Okay, Jonathan. Jonathan is off to vote then in that case, and I'm going to bring Melanie Wilkes, our head of research, onto the call. What this will mean, everybody who's tuning in, is the event was due to finish at around 2:45. Hopefully, Jonathan will only be 10 minutes, so we'll extend the event. Essentially, Jonathan has sort of given us a bit of extra time at the back end. But in the meantime, Mel, welcome to the call. Thanks for stepping in. One of the things that I was going to ask Jonathan, I'll try and get his reflections on when he comes back, is the extent to which there might be, and my cat has just joined the event as well, whether there's a potential tension between Jonathan and his desire to kind of devolve and some of the things he was saying earlier around the kind of conditionality regime, and whether actually we think that there may be some tension for local government or other third sector organisations in engaging more in the delivery of some of this employment support if they ultimately feel that they're participating in a kind of conditionality regime or a sanctions regime.
You're absolutely right. It would be really good to explore this more with Jonathan, but as you say, we know that in places like Greater Manchester, Scotland, where there have been really interesting examples of devolved employment support in place, there's an inherent tension and challenge there where organisations that have a responsibility to support kind of vulnerable individuals, people on very, very low incomes, will often be really reluctant to then be involved in sharing information with DWP that could lead to that individual or their family facing a drop in their benefits, a benefit sanction. And that applies to the third sector too. So one of the things that Jonathan mentioned in his Financial Times interview was that he'd like to see greater involvement of charity sector providers alongside some of the larger primes that he was talking about just now. But again, there we'd probably expect to see some caution and reluctance to be involved in mandatory employment support systems. And I think there's a broader question about how you can achieve the ambition of reducing the fear and stigma associated with Job Centre Plus in particular, while reaching a sort of wider group of people and involving a broader mix of different providers.
Yes. And I mean, in your sort of career history, where you spent a bit of time working at Scope, and a lot of what we talked about in the first part of the event was around, you know, those with long-term conditions being able to be supported into work where they are seeking work. Do you have reflections on some of what you've heard from Jonathan and the Labour Party today, or things that you would like to see more?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what I would say is, you know, for people that aren't very close to sort of employment support, or perhaps haven't looked in this, it's worth saying it's hard to underscore how different some of the things that Jonathan had described are from the types of support that are available at the moment. So he talked about something called IPS, which is individual placement and support. Now, that's very tailored approach to employment support, where you've got clinicians working alongside specialist employment support professionals. It's place then train, so it's support where you've got specialist services working alongside an individual once they've started a job. So rather than people cycling through things like a CV workshop or training and moving from one training course to another, they are moving into competitive employment in the labour market, applying for the same jobs that anybody else might be able to apply for, but getting tailored support as they do that. And crucially, that support is also available for the employer. So an employer that might not be familiar with things like the Access to Work scheme Jonathan mentioned, the law around workplace adjustments, the provider would be able to support that employer with making sure that support's in place at the right time and getting induction in place. The other thing, I think, aside from sort of specific schemes, Jonathan talked about employment support being an ongoing dynamic process. And I think, again, that it's hard to underscore how different a shift that would be, where I think in truth at the moment, what we do see with job centres and employment support more broadly is a cycle, people cycling in and out of often quite low paid, quite precarious work. But it's not seen that way. People are sort of encouraged to apply for jobs, and then the support sort of stops there, or they're encouraged to increase their earnings, but usually through increasing their hours. What the system doesn't really account for is that, you know, lots of us will experience changes in our needs and preferences around work throughout our working lives, whether that's things like needing more flexibility around a change in our health and well-being, wanting to reduce hours temporarily around things like caring commitments, childcare responsibilities. And so the types of advice and support that you might want to navigate those changes will differ, but there might be a need, an ongoing need for support and advice as you're managing those shifts. So I'd really welcome that, I think, both in terms of health and well-being, but also thinking about the workforce more broadly and the nature of employment support.
Yes, yes. These aren't small changes, though, are they? Because I suppose in the way you've just reflected there, I mean, we are both talking about a significant shift in the kind of culture around some of this, but actually making that change and making it real for sort of people on the receiving end of those services, that's going to take a bit of time, presumably, and quite a bit of investment as well in terms of making it real.
Absolutely. I mean, I think some of the points that Jonathan made about the way funding is allocated are very well made. There are questions about some things that you could probably do reasonably quickly with money that's been underspent. But that cultural shift, getting to a place where employment support services are presented as a public service and perceived as a public service by people that are accessing them, is not something that's going to happen overnight. There is huge stigma associated with engaging with Job Centre Plus. You know, Jonathan talked about the infamous kind of brown envelopes. Lots of people certainly don't see it as a service, and certainly the interviews that we ran earlier this year with people who were on universal credit and interested in accessing training, even where they had a good relationship with their work coach, they still described that relationship as being about kind of monitoring, rather than access to support to navigate a system. So you had this, you know, Jonathan was talking about the system not being very coordinated, lots of different pockets of support. We had bizarre situations where, for example, an individual had heard about HGV driver boot camps, I think perhaps on the news because there were shortages, spoke to their work coach about it who wasn't aware of the scheme, was then having to conduct their own research online to find out about DFE provision because the Department for Education provision, because the Department for Work and Pensions colleagues weren't kind of up to date about it. And I think that's not meant just as criticism of DWP, because I think there's a much wider structural point there about what happens when you create this hodgepodge or patchwork of different forms of employment support. And it's very difficult if you're a work coach delivering 10-minute long appointments to try and then keep track of the different needs and preferences of the individuals you're supporting and the support that's available in local areas. So I think that that's not something you address overnight and will take a really big shift in effort.
And again, in what you're reflecting on there with the connections to the DFE and other programs across government, it sort of reflects some of what Jonathan was sort of getting to as well around the need for this to be a kind of cross-government effort. Another sort of element which we've looked at over the last 12 months and actually the last 24 months really, Mel, has been around the importance of flexible working for supporting people into sort of sustained employment and making sure those opportunities are there. When Jonathan does get back, I am going to ask him about the right to flexible working on day one, but it would be great just to get your reflections from the research that we've done as to how that can play a part in supporting people into employment.
Absolutely. Well, so the situation at the moment is that legally we're only entitled to ask for flexible working after we've been in work for some time. So it's, you know, once you've been in work for 26 weeks, you have a right to request flexible working. The two crucial things about that are the delay and then the fact that it's a right to request, not to have it. So you can request a flexible working arrangement, but your employer can refuse it. This year, the current government has run a consultation on looking at changing those regulations to narrow down the number of reasons that employers can use to justify a refusal. But we would still be looking at that same waiting period. And what that means in practice is that people who need flexibility in order to be able to do their job, you know, again, talking about people that might have a long-term health condition, disabled people with caring responsibilities, just won't apply for a job if they think that flexibility isn't going to be feasible. And when you think about just how precarious that first period, those first few months can feel if you're on a probationary period, lots of people will be really nervous to ask for flexibility that they might otherwise need. Now, lots of employers already go above and beyond what the law asks them to do. You can advertise flexibility in your job adverts, you can discuss it through the interview process. But if you're not doing that already, then the chances are people that might most benefit from flexibility aren't applying for jobs that they want to do. And with that, I see that Jonathan's back, so I'll hand back to you both.
Thank you so much, Mel, and welcome back, Jonathan. Hopefully you've caught your breath having ran back over to Portcullis House. Mel and I were just discussing, Jonathan, the importance of flexible working in order to support some people who perhaps either have caring responsibilities or who have longer term conditions, and that's a primary reason why they're not participating in the labour market. I know this is something which Angela Rayner has sort of set out, but will the next Labour government be supportive of a right to flexible working on day one?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And, I mean, this is, you know, this isn't the remit of the Department of Work and Pensions, although it has a very obvious impact on our work. And I think, you know, increasing numbers of over 50s are leaving the labour market now. So that is because, you know, they're probably getting access via the George Osborne pension freedoms to some income. They feel better off, perhaps equity in their homes. But some of them will be effectively forced out of work. It may well be that they want to help their children with caring for their grandchildren because their children cannot afford extortionate childcare costs, which families are now grappling with. And childcare is another barrier to helping people move into work. And it's very disappointing that childcare element of the universal credit was frozen again in the budget or some statement 2 weeks ago or so. And they may well increasingly now be caring for a partner or a parent, a loved one who has got a health condition. We all know that withstanding the recent impacts on life expectancy, particularly post-COVID, in broad terms, we are all living longer. And I know from my days in the health service, one of the facts dementia research will tell you is that one in three people born this year will go on to develop dementia. Yes. So we've got an increasing burden of dementia in society, and a lot of the care for those with dementia will fall upon family members, and that in turn is pushing people out of work. So there does need to be flexible work options. It may well be that you want to help your mother or father in the mornings, and then you want to go to work for a bit and then come back. It may well, we need to support people to find the right job that offers flexible patterns for them. Another issue, by the way, is flexible work and I think this is increasingly coming to the fore as more people are prepared to speak out about their own personal circumstances. We know menopause is an increasing issue for many women of that age group as well, and flexible work or sympathetic employers in that field, I think, is something that policymakers are increasingly beginning to look at. I think also has to be taken into account in these debates as well.
Yes, absolutely. We've had lots of questions, Jonathan, through the course of the event so far. One that we've had from Josiah Mortimer from the Daily Mirror sort of touches back on something we were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is, would Labour increase the funding for long COVID treatment centres to help deal with people who are off work with that condition? Is there sort of specific plans around that?
Well, I mean, I'm going to slightly answer the question. I hope my friends from the Daily Mirror don't hold that against me, because that the funding settlement, that would be something for my colleague Wes Streeting, the national, who's obviously now the Shadow Health Secretary, and will put forward our funding proposals and NHS proposals at the next election. But what at the root of the question is, in this context, is that we know that people are forced out of work. Some of it is long COVID, and I think there's increasing numbers of people applying for PIP because of long COVID. We know that more and more people lost out of work because of growing mental health problems in society. More people, by the way, it looks like we've got a growing burden of people with back and neck problems. Historically, back and neck problems was always associated with heavy industrial labour, for obvious reasons. Interesting question now is the growing burden of back and neck problems, the consequence of more and more people work from home, working on laptops in poor conditions, because people don't have offices in their homes. Offices are set up with chairs, ought to be set up, not always, ought to, in theory, be set up with appropriate chairs, computers at appropriate level. If you're working off a kitchen table or working on your sofa, things like that, and working from home is not the great convenience, if I can put it like that, for everybody. It really does impact on the conditions of your home. So I'm not saying that is because of work from home, but there is some debate, some discussion about whether working from home.
Well, I think it underscores the importance of individuals who are working from home, making sure they've got the equipment they need to be able to work from home in a sort of healthy and sustainable way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So, but to answer the mayor's question in a sort of different way, do I want to do more joined up work between the Job Centre Employment Services and NHS services? Absolutely, because we now surely know, particularly we saw it directly in the pandemic, that health impacts your ability to go to work, and the nature of your work impacts on your health. We need to look at these things together and do more and work together.
Absolutely. We've had a couple of questions, Jonathan, one from Nick Powell, for example, who's sort of positing the fact that it would be great to have a work coach and return to work offer to all over 50s, not just those on benefit. And that was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you, actually, is the extent to which you're thinking about your proposals in a way of sort of almost breaking the link between needing to be on universal credit in order to receive eligibility for employment support.
Yeah. I think this is a great question, because I think we've got to move towards a system of a universal job service or a universal employment service. At the moment, as you all know, the Job Centre is there, particularly for people who short-term unemployed who are claiming universal credit. Really, I mean, and then people with complex disadvantages and long-term unemployed get sent on these various different national schemes and dip, like a sheep dip approach, which I don't think works. That's why we need devolution. But I think the job centre should be a public service in every community, there for everybody who needs it. That obviously raises questions about future resourcing of job centres, but in principle, that is the approach that we want. It should be, as my friend Alison McGovern describes, as a learning and work centre for every area. And if you are over 50 and you want to return to work, but you are not on benefits because you have got security already, then you should be able to get help from the job centre to be able to find the right role for you. And the other thing I want to look at and explore is how the job centre can offer training and reskilling you as well. What is its role? I mean, this obviously does become expensive. So this is not a this is something I'm exploring rather than announcing new policies. I just want to put it in that context. But for example, a graduate can leave university or whatever and go and get an apprenticeship and for free. Somebody in their 50s who wants to do level 3 training or retraining to develop a new skill and get a new job has to take out a loan. Yeah. So surely there's a better way in which we can provide a skill support offer for people to turn to work in their 50s or retrain in their 50s. And this will become more and more important because the world is changing, perhaps not as rapidly as some of the sort of dystopian prophets of doom suggested, where the idea that robots was going to take over everything and would all be redundant because of automation and robots. Maybe it's not been as dramatic as some have been arguing, but we certainly know there will be changes in the labour market, which will impact, and people will need to retrain to adapt to that. Of course they will.
And we know that the UK is not in a fantastic position relative to other OECD nations when it comes to having that culture of adult learning and the access as you describe. One issue, Jonathan, I mean, you've touched upon it actually earlier on around the limitations or the kind of some of the fallacies around a regime of getting people back into work using primarily sanctions or a kind of punitive regime, and the fact that we can see that hasn't worked. One of the frustrations from I suppose lots of us who work in the sector is there isn't all that much transparency around what the evidence actually says works in some of this. Is that something which as a Labour government you would look to be more open and transparent around, where I think you've said in the end conditionality will continue to be part of the system because you have to think about taxpayers, but you want to know what works in the end and what's actually achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve.
Yeah, I'm a pragmatist. So you're going to have a degree of conditionality because you have got to protect the taxpayer. Sadly, one or two people, will want to say, do abuse the system. That's life. I think we all understand that, and know people recognise that. But it's about culture, isn't it? And it's about emphasis. The culture has changed. The job centres have become tightly controlled, following rigid national rules. They're inflexible, they're bureaucratic, and it feels like they treat people as criminals rather than people who want to self-improve and build a career. And that's the difference. We should reward people for self-improvement if they want to retrain or find skills. Job centres should help people build a career, build a life, not a kind of pushed into the old low-paid job, regardless of what it means for you as an individual. When we know people are in poverty pay, when we know that the link between raising yourself out of poverty and work has been broken, work poverty is on the increase, we are clearly doing something wrong. So we have to change the culture of the job centre. We are going to have, in some circumstances, a conditionality regime, obviously, but at the moment we know, or we suspect that, in the last 10 years or so, we've been periods where we strongly suspect there were target sanctions, and sanctions are on the increase again. This is not the approach that we want. The job centre should be a place where people want to go to and want to engage with, not a place of fear, like it has become for too many people. And part will be transparency. one of the things I've been absolutely shocked by when I moved into the Department of Work and Pensions brief, following spending, as I say, actually being Labour's longest sort of health person in history, actually, according to Wikipedia anyway, or recent history, I should say, was the complete lack of transparency in this world. You can log on somewhere and you can find out what the waiting lists are like at your local hospital and all that kind of stuff, and what cancer waits are like, and what A&E performance is like, and so on. We don't know which job centres perform well and which job centres don't perform. We don't know. It's not even clear to me, and maybe you could help me on this. Keep asking people, what is the basis on which a job centre is funded? I mean, in the NHS, there are funding formulas which, in theory, take account of derivation. Actually, the Conservatives have slightly have made them less sensitive to derivation. But in principle, you have a health funding formula which is supposed to ensure that areas of greater poverty, greater need, where there is greater sickness, get a more generous funding settlement in terms of health services. Also take into account population as well, etc., etc. It takes all kinds of things into account. No one can explain to me, unless I'm looking in the wrong place, how a job centre gets its funding. I mean, so I think there's questions about funding formulas to ensure that a job centre in an area of, Sutton in Ashfield, an area of high levels of economic inactivity, what resources they get compared to a job centre in Tunbridge Wells or whatever. We need full transparency, because that is how you drive improvement in public services. So absolutely full transparency. And related to that, I know this isn't the focus of this discussion, and related to that, I think we need full transparency as well for people who have been pushed through the very worst, harsh elements of the work capability assessment, and things have ended up particularly awful consequences as a result of that. We need full transparency. So yes, I would hope to have the most transparent Department of Work and Pensions in history.
Fantastic. I mean, that is a fantastic commitment. I'm really appreciative, Jonathan, that you've given us a bit of extra time off the back. If it's all right, I've got one more sort of set of questions, probably another 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Fine, yeah.
Super. So I mean, you've touched upon it really around the sort of low wage economy that we've sort of almost sort of sleptwalk into over the last 12 years post financial crisis. And from the Work Foundation's perspective, we've been looking at the extent to which insecurity within the labour market, of which low pay is an element, has become a feature really. And our Insecure Work Index estimates that over 6 million people in the UK are currently in some form of severely insecure work. And clearly this is relevant from the Work and Pensions brief perspective, because you want people ultimately to be moving into sustained, well-paid work, and not ultimately having their wages topped up via universal credit in order to make ends meet. So I suppose initially, just a question as to whether that's a sort of picture that you recognise and that you sort of see yourself along with other colleagues in across departments, sort of looking to sort of make a real change on, should Labour get elected at the next election, and ensuring that work pays essentially.
Yeah, I think well, yes. I mean, and I think that's why we're committed to raising the national living wage. One of the things that we're exploring is how to improve. I mean, your point is about those who have to rely, people shouldn't have to rely on universal credit to top up wages. Right? And absolutely.
And I suppose as well, Jonathan, some of the rhetoric that we've had from government recently about almost any job is better than no job. And yet actually we know that insecure work can be just as bad for your health and your mental well-being as unemployment, actually. And what's more, you see then people bounce back out of the labour market really, really quickly.
I mean, absolutely. So if you're dealing with a cohort of people who are out of work for, say, mental health conditions, just pushing them into low-paid, unfulfilling work is not actually going to solve problems that we're facing. And that one, I said this earlier. We said to me, what about national targets and things like that? Or will you allow innovation? We will allow innovation. But one of the things I will insist on is part of the deal for devolution is if we are giving money to local areas, we want people to be moved into good, well-paid, proper jobs. If a local area is just moving people into poverty pay, 0 hours contracts, insecure work, that is not what this devolution plan is about. So I'm afraid I will insist on that. And there may well be one or two areas who bristle at that and like it, but I think that is important. It's important to use the power of the state in procuring, if you like, and securing services to drive up workplace standards and wages. That's the first thing. The second thing is, although we want to lift people off universal credit by ensuring they're in good paid jobs, there will be still people, whether they're working part-time or whether they need help with housing, will need to rely on universal credit. And we need to look at the different features within universal credit to sand off the rough edges to ensure that make work pays, the old sort of phrase that gets used. We want to make work pay. So we are also committed to quite fundamental reforms of universal credit, and that's what we are looking at exploring at the moment, how we better support people with childcare, how we better support people with housing need, how we better support families with children, not penalise families for having children, as happens in the system. That is a whole big area of work that we're currently looking at, and how the work allowance, which only applies to specific groups in universal credit, what is the future of the work allowance within universal credit more broadly. So that is something we are definitely exploring and looking into, because just pushing people into low paid jobs and expecting them to survive and support themselves is not going to work. We have to restructure our economy so people have good jobs to go to.
So I mean, this what you mentioned there, Jonathan, around the kind of part of the devolution deal, essentially being that the jobs that people are moved into are higher paid and sustainable and have secure employment rights. We're doing some regional analysis at the moment. It's not quite ready to try and understand exactly where concentrations of insecure and low paid work are across the country. My suspicion is that there will be a big overlap between areas of high welfare dependency and where those jobs exist. So I suppose, again, it speaks to this need for an incoming Labour government to be very joined up about its economic development strategy, its industrial strategy, alongside employment support, because some of the areas that are going to be most in need of that employment support are going to have the fewest well-paid, secure job opportunities in.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. But I think it is better having a system which can be tailored to local economic needs, and the idea that Whitehall can design a one-size-fits-all system, which is this sort of sheep dip approach. We've got to have fundamental change, and I think it's one of the ways in which you can deliver it.
Yes, we're coming up to 3 o'clock, Jonathan. I'd like to give you a sort of an opportunity, I suppose, just to sort of reflect on, or the question I have is what the sort of central ambition for the next Labour government in this space would be. You've mentioned a few, I think, around full employment and whatnot, but if I were to sort of, we cast forward to the end of the next Parliament and you were looking back, what would sort of success for you look like, given the agenda that you're setting out today?
Oh, well, good quality full employment.
Yeah. Good
quality full employment. So people can live a life of dignity, that they can provide for themselves, their families, their loved one, if they can build a home in which they feel secure, and crucially one in which they can also save for their future and their retirement. I haven't touched upon retirement much in this discussion, or for today's workers. I mean, we want people to be able to save for their future as well. And one of the problems of being bounced through these 0 hours contracts, low paid work, insecure work, is it's undermining people's ability to save for their future as well. We're all very proud in the policy world that we've made progress on automatic enrollment. Still too many people missing out on that. And in some ways, today's cost of living crisis, where people can't afford to save for the future or because of the nature of the work that they're in, is storing up a cost of living crisis for tomorrow. So, very simple.
Exactly.
Things, I suppose, or things that I want to achieve, but complex policy agenda to get there.
Absolutely, but a fantastic ambition, I think. And I think that just about brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this afternoon. I'd like to say a huge thank you again, Jonathan, to you for spending your time with us, as well as everybody who's attended on Zoom, is watching live on YouTube, and even who's listening in the future on podcast. A big thank you also to the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis, but also on putting sessions like this together. A quick plug, if you want to find out more about the UK Insecure Work Index, and in particular how insecure work is affecting women disproportionately, then please do check out our website. For now though, thank you once again, and I hope you found the discussion valuable and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Good.